Welcome everybody. So we are at Brown Farm. So as you know, you came through here under the Blue Ridge Parkway. We drove down here and are over here by the main house. So we are, if everyone is comfortable, if we have some four-wheel drive vehicles, we can drive up to the top of here for a nice view of this area. We're going to drive back here. They've got a feedlot that doesn't show on this aerial, but back here so we can talk about the working area of the farm and maybe how we might handle that as a farmstead area. And that's about it for the tour, but we will be going over, like I mentioned, project evaluation, monitoring and baseline documentation a little bit, as well as going through the easement deed. So if you will look at your project evaluation sheet, this is from LTA Standards and Practices, and it just outlines in a little more detail some of the things that you might look for when you're out on the property for a site inspection. So we won't walk through this in too much detail. It's just for your benefit. We kind of talked through a lot of it yesterday in the classroom, but it does have, you know, a nice list of things to think about, like we talked about with access, boundaries, land use, hazards, adjacent land use, those sorts of things. So it's just a good reference to have. And some of the things we can talk about as we'll likely talk about many of these as we're going through the easement template. So, but it also has looking for conservation values like the water resources, habitat, ag values, of course, in our case, open space, cultural features, etc. So that is for you to review and take home. And then we will begin walking through the easement template. That's going to be the majority of what we spend today on. So if you will pull out your easement template. So the way the easement starts out, we name the parties. The grantor is the landowner, the grantee is the easement holder entity, and the funding entities. So in this case, we've got ADFP, NRCS, and whomever the easement holder would be. Then it goes through and outlines the grant amounts and the percentages of the sources that they're coming from. The percentages of those grant amounts, which is important. If there's an issue with condemnation down the road, we'll talk about that later. If there's any condemnation, all parties would get their proportionate share of the funding back. We go through the recitals where it talks about the property. We used a different template at each workshop too, so I'm looking at this one a little bit for the first time. So all of these templates are available on ADFP's website. But here we go through and we're listing out more specifically the conservation values of the property. Hey, Mr. Blake. This is Blake Brown.
Yeah, don't let me interrupt, but
no.
I really thought this was a great group, and I'm really wondering now because I'm not one of these, and they're pretty sketchy at this point. So, how you doing?
Good.
And I mean, look at his cap, and he looks like he's retired to me. What he's doing out here. So.
He said he's retired, but works about 4 jobs, I think. Yeah.
Good gracious! I tell you what, it's going downhill. It's going downhill all the time. So.
Well, thank you for having us. We have a map of the property, so we're just talking about a few places that we're going to stop, and we're just going through some different documents and things that we talked about in the classroom yesterday. So
Good deal. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, and I'm sorry I didn't tell my son. He's like, "Who are all those people?" I forgot to tell you. It's a crazy day here. We're putting in embryos in our recipient cows, and our vet called and said, "I'll be there at 10." We were thinking he was going to be here at like 2 o'clock this afternoon. So,
Scramble.
yeah, so we're scrambling. But enjoy yourselves. It's kind of ragged this time of year because we just have got cattle out on grass. So, but it's as I told Lisa and I told Garrett that basically, you know, it's a beautiful place to farm. It's a beautiful place to live. It's frankly a very difficult place to make a farm work in terms of profitability. So it's challenging. But we do my son and daughter-in-law are into the show cattle, so they're actually have turned that into a small business that's paying its way. And we have a retail beef business. And so we just bought, if you go through Deep Gap and you see Jim's Produce, we just actually leased that facility, and we'll continue the produce business there, and we'll sell our beef and pork there as well. Nice. And my son and my daughter-in-law is going to manage it. She's quit her job with Farm Bureau, and she's going to manage that facility. So we hope that'll maybe double our beef business. So.
Good deal. Well, thank you.
Tell my son not to give up his day job now.
Yeah, well, now my son works for Farm Credit, so he's not giving that job up. My son's a loan officer for Farm Credit. He's off today, so we can put embryos in. So, but enjoy yourselves. Good to see all of you. Like I said, great group, even with these 3 guys in there. So.
Well, thank you.
All right, thank
you so much.
And if you have any, I'll be at the barn.
Okay. All right.
Absolutely. Good to see everybody.
Yes.
You too. Okay, so we are outlining the conservation values more specifically, so both the primary and the secondary purposes. So here it talks about even road frontage and natural habitats. So all of those things that we're going to recognize as our conservation values. Let's see. And then we go through and outline the enabling legislation, all of those statutes that we looked at yesterday, the state statutes. And if y'all have questions or want to look at any of these in more detail, just stop me. And let's see.
I think number 3 is one we all need to be reminded of. What we're trying to do for the long run haul and the health and welfare of the people, promote sound, prosperous agriculture and rural life.
Yes.
I think that's
promote the efficient production and utilization of the products of the soil as essential to the health and welfare of our people, and to promote a sound and prosperous agricultural and rural life as indispensable to the maintenance of maximum prosperity. Very eloquent. Mm-hmm. Yes. Very important. We're doing this for public benefit, not just the benefit of the farmer. So let's see. Now, therefore, this kind of wraps up that everyone is entering into this agreement voluntarily. The rights are being given up permanently, and it is the duty of both the grantor and the grantee to uphold these covenants. We've got a place to put in an access easement if necessary, if there's not already clear public access roadway to the property. And then we move into the articles. So Article 1 has some general information about how and why we're doing the easement, and then we'll move into prohibited and restricted activities. So, who has 1-1? All right, I guess we'll pass the mic around.
And we're just kind of summing it up?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep, and if anyone has questions or comments about all of them, any of them.
Are we just holding it?
I guess, yeah.
I don't know. Okay. I'll do my best. So Article 1 just generally lays out the primary purpose of the deed, which is to enable the protected property to remain in agricultural use and preserve the soils and basically and limit non-agricultural uses that might negatively affect that, the conservation values of that property. So, and it also just kind of generally states that any activity that would impair that from being protected is not allowed. And then also as a secondary purpose, it talks about as long as it's not inconsistent with the primary purpose, it also protects the natural, historic, recreational habitat or scenic values also. And the second paragraph just kind of lays out that it's not going to restrict any types of agricultural operations as long as they're consistent with the purpose and they don't break any laws and all of that. Hopefully I'm going in depth.
No, you're doing great.
And then it also references in that paragraph and the next two paragraphs, A and B, on the next page, it references other sections that this pertains to, which I think we'll go over. So I'm not going to talk about those,
Yep.
but it talks about the activities which are subject to other qualifications but that are allowed are agricultural production, which includes production, processing, and marketing of crops and livestock, as long as it's compatible with the purpose. And then forest management and timber harvest are also allowed as long as it's also compatible with that purpose.
Great. Yeah, I think this is just so important because in every clause we'll see how it comes back to the purpose, back to the conservation values, ensuring that all the activities are consistent with those values. There's no incompatible uses, and we are entering into this primarily for agricultural and forest purposes. Okay.
I have a question that gets asked periodically, and that's, do I have to harvest trees?
No, certainly not. So we'll see in the forest management that's going to come back to the forest management plan.
Right, but how is that? I knew that was the answer, but how is that? It's just like right here where it says are allowed. It doesn't mean.
Yeah, you don't have
So
to.
okay.
Yeah. There is a clause, at least in the other templates, so I assume in here also that there can be no, what is it called, wild, forever wild, no forever wild. So I guess you cannot prohibit the activity of forestry, but you're not required to do so. Yeah. All right, perpetual duration.
So this section just says that the ALE deed is perpetual, so it's going to last forever, and that it is enforceable against the grantor's representatives, successors, leasees, and all of that stuff.
Yep. So easy answer. There's no way out. So condemnation is an issue that we'll talk about later, and hopefully in those cases it's just a small portion of the property for a right-of-way, but hopefully it's also a deterrent, especially when we have state and federal funds, to find another path of least resistance for those things. And lost my other point. Okay, keep doing that. All right, 1.3, extinguishment of development rights.
That was Eric's, right?
Eric, okay. So this is just saying that the development rights are extinguished forever. They are not transferred to the grantee so that they can use them down the road. There's no way that you can get those back. They are extinguished forever. They cannot be used for a transfer of development rights down the road to increase, density in one area. They're gone. So, compliance with other regulatory requirements.
This one basically just says that the grantor is responsible for complying with any additional permits or regulations, including county, state, or federal requirements.
Yep, that's always going to supersede the easement. So, okay, and then we'll move into prohibited and restricted activities.
Yeah, so this just begins the, like you said, the list of the prohibited activities. First major one, obviously, is subdivision, which of course is not allowed at all, just like the development rights. And then if you flip the page, it goes on to talk about the allowed industrial and commercial use, because basically everything is prohibited except for the four things listed there under the B paragraph, which of course the first one is agricultural production. As long as it's consistent with the terms of the deed, then that's allowed. The sale of excess power generated, as long again as it's consistent with the ALA deed. Temporary or seasonal outdoor activities, as long as it's consistent with the deed. And then the commercial enterprises, as long as they are related to agriculture and forestry, agritourism, processing, packaging, all that stuff. Then it does allow for buildings that are appropriate for housing, farm machinery, and that sort of thing. Which is actually an interesting, I don't know about the rest of you guys, but the definition of agritourism is an interesting one. How much you think that they would allow, like a cafe, for instance. But, so that's about it for 2-1. And I guess, there's no definitive definition of agritourism, right?
There is later on in here, there's,
Okay, so, but,
It's in the statute as well.
okay.
so is it taken directly from the statute?
So if you go to the bona fide farm statute 160D, it actually includes a comprehensive listing of those different activities that are allowed. And so these easements mirror the statute as it currently is written. So once we get later in the document, that whole list is actually in the general statutes for, and really that part of the statute is for zoning purposes, but that is where the agritourism activities are more specifically defined.
Laid out. Okay. All right.
I think it's important to point out with subdivision that there are some easements that allow for subdivision. So if you have a donated easement, or if you know some partners, land trusts that have easements, or your landowner knows folks that have easements with other land trusts, it's possible that those do allow for subdivision. So just make sure that they're aware that with ADFP funding or NRCS funding, there's no subdivision allowed. So. And then on, just gonna make a point on solar. So we had a lot of discussions about solar in the other workshops too. So they can have solar power for the purpose of the farm, and if they have excess energy because they're not using it for the farm seasonally, or there's just a little bit of excess, it can be sold back. But they can't increase the size or make it something that more than what the farm itself needs.
Yeah, and solar is not going to be allowed on the protected areas anyways.
In the farmstead.
Well, in the farmstead, it can be if it's related to the ag operation.
Right, yeah.
But anywhere in the protected area, so when we look at the easement language, there's going to be a difference between farmstead areas and the protected area, or the protected property. So no solar in there. I mean, that's been a big debate, but in North Carolina, if you look at properties in which solar has been established, those are considered commercial. So the taxation rates are not, it puts those properties out of present use value, and so we consider it in that same manner. So you've probably heard stories about how they've been able to do those types of things in other states, but it just doesn't fit with our property assessments. So, and it's inconsistent with this. Our opinion is once you put concrete posts in the ground, then it's not going to go back, right? So.
Right, you're disturbing the soils.
Yep.
So it might not be a full showstopper, but something that you need to acknowledge and make sure that it's going to be compatible with the easement.
Yep. So like one example, we funded a grant several years ago for a pilot project, Mountain Valley's RC&D, with solar hot water for dairies. So installing solar panels on at dairy operations on the barns and sheds to help supplement or offset those costs for hot water heating. So obviously any way to make operations more profitable we'll look at, but I mean those are really going to be exclusive to the farmstead areas.
Evan, let me ask, in that particular instance, if they put solar on top of the structures to meet their needs, but they could install, 5 extra panels because they had the space to do so and sell that back. I mean, is that kind of a gray area, or is that still compatible?
Well, I'm going to be my section for resurfaces. So really, if it was already on an existing structure, that wouldn't move the needle because it was already established as an impervious surface. So I don't see that as an issue. And again, we always got to look at, in the farmstead area, if they had the allowance to add to, then I would see that as an acceptable use.
And it doesn't push it into the commercial side of things because it's not establishing a new operation.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Moving on to 2.2, surface and subsurface mining.
Easy answer, just basically just don't do it. So mining or extraction of soil, sand, gravel, oil, natural gas, fuel, coal, or any other mineral substance owned by a grantor as of the date of this ALE deed or later acquired by the grantor using any surface mining surface mining or dredging method from the protected property is prohibited.
Okay. Easy answer. Prohibited. Don't do it.
Well, it can't get complicated because if you look at the section there about limited mining activities for materials used to facilitate the agricultural operations. So our most common example with monitoring would be if there's a property along a river and there was a flooding event and soil from that flooding event came onto the protected property. It is disrupting the ag operation. Then certainly moving that is allowed. So those are probably the most common scenarios that we see with monitoring on that. But we always want to go back to preserving the topsoil for ag production. So if it's something that, an activity that's going to disturb that, then that would be prohibited.
So you can use it on the protected property to improve your roads, that sort of thing. It cannot be taken off the property. That starts to become considered mining, especially if you're bartering or selling, clearly. So, okay. Surface alteration.
This one addresses issues that would totally remove topsoil or totally destroy the productivity of the soil. So, blasting or grading or moving it away, it's gone, so there's no productivity left. But it does allow to build irrigation ponds and such types things to address drainage issues on the farm that are related to productivity, control erosion, and you can continue to do agricultural activities that support the farm. You just can't put it in a dump truck and haul it away.
No sod farming.
Yeah,
Yep.
sod farming is taking the topsoil away from the tract of land.
Okay. Motorized vehicle use.
All right, this is basically stating that the grantors shall not use any motor vehicles on the property except for or give the permission to use those, except for the agricultural uses, forestry, habitat management, law enforcement, public safety, and other conservation uses, provided that, you have to remember, coming back to the goal of this, that it doesn't, any of those do not create impacts detrimental to the soil productivity. Except for snowmobiles. As long as there's snow, you can run all over the place. So
Not disturbing the soil, yep.
yeah, I mean, as long as it's snow, you're fine.
Yeah.
And it's pretty simple stated. I didn't have to read it too many times, but just you have the ability to use motor vehicles as long as it's accomplishing agricultural purpose, and as long as it's not deterring some of the soil.
Right. And I think Evan made a good point about the protected property versus the farmstead area. So when I think of protected property, I typically think of the entire property, but in this case, protected property means outside of the farmstead area. So farmstead area, different rules would apply there.
Yep. So, if you're a motorsports fan like me, be sure to put your dirt track in excluded. That would be preferred method. At farmstead if you have to. But one thing, a question that has come up, and again, these are very detailed, nuanced questions. There's 1,000 million variables for all these things. So what about hunting, right? Those rights are retained. What about ATVs for that? Well, if you want to get down to the details, agritourism includes hunting. So again, we want to try to encourage folks to limit their impact. So there's probably already established trails. So using those types of motorized vehicles, get on a four-wheeler or a gator on those established paths or trails. But if you remember, hunting is a part of agritourism. So that, in my interpretation, that would be an allowed use.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, would you state that in the agreement that you would make sure that
agritourism include it later on when we get that part, it says hunting explicitly.
All right. Yep. So it's in there.
Okay, so we'll finish section 2 and then we'll go get a change of scenery and move here. Dumping and trash.
And this one, it's prohibiting the dumping and storage of soil, trash, refuge. In other words, get a big dumpster and clean up those places where you've left stuff abandoned for a while. That would include appliances, old machinery that's not included, antique machinery.
Don't get us started on this.
Or hazardous substances. And this is one we've had a debate on with the old equipment and how it is presented on the farm. So, typically in a lot of situations you would have an older couple or someone that is out of active farming, but they still have some remnants of the machinery that was used on the farm. So, ticklish point there. Underground and above ground storage tanks are prohibited unless they're used for agricultural products and byproducts, and I guess fuel storage too. So long as storage has to be done in a manner acceptable or applicable to government rules and regulations, in a manner that it doesn't impair the conservation values of the property.
Got some more language related to storage tanks later on too. Structures and improvements. Rich.
Okay. It says there shall be no buildings or list various structures there unless they're specifically authorized. And it says they should be of reasonable size, proportion, height, and character so as not to distract from the open space and agricultural purpose. So it says under no circumstances are there, and then it lists specific things, including recreational fields, golf courses, ranges, airstrips, or helicopter pads. So those are pretty specific. Even though I know several farmers who have airstrips on their farms, and in fact I know there used to be a guy up in the Madison Angel up in Davie County. He had a farm. He had farms down east. He used to fly down there routinely, but I guess he'd have to
So that'd be a case where we could
his
carve it
airstrip.
out, yeah. Yeah, just exclude
Carve
it.
out or have it within the farmstead.
Actually,
That'd probably be a big farmstead with a landing strip, don't you think? So I'd probably exclude it just to be on the safe side.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if it was farmstead, does it fall under the impervious surface rule then?
Yeah, the whole property is. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So even
Yeah.
exclusions count towards the
Well,
impervious?
not
or
exclude.
no?
So farmsteads are included with it. Yeah.
Right,
So that's
okay.
me. Yeah. So, but excluded areas, not with the easement,
Right.
would be not applicable to that.
So you can put your helicopter pad in an
Right.
exclusion.
Put your putting
Yes.
green. Putting green.
Camera around, you don't need.
Yeah. So the farm could be around the excluded area, but. Okay, signage.
Okay, signage. public signage are prohibited unless they have to do with the protected property, and that has to do with the any status of the farm, and be it in any type of status of farmland preservation, or the address or occupant, or advertising the farm itself as the activities that go along with, I imagine, with agritourism. And of course, those rules have to follow any type of zoning county laws. If they have kind of signage laws in their county, that would have to be, they'd have to follow under those rules before they had an agricultural sign. And I've got some questions about that. I got questions about everything, but I don't want to hold us up all day.
Well, no, bring them on.
Well, Mr. Brown right here is going to do a beef operation, okay? He's going to buy a store over there. And he's going right by the Blue Ridge Parkway. We don't want... okay. Everybody usually... So you wouldn't want nothing tacky, but could he have a sign here that represents his market, representing he's growing beef on this farm? Would that work as part of the project? I just had that scenario hit my head as he walked back and told me what his plans were.
To advertise an on-site activity.
On-site activity, so you got granular on me. Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
That answered it.
And there's
Man,
no
it's good, isn't it?
size restriction on that.
I think it's just with the
With the ordinance, okay. So whatever the county would allow for the size, which would probably be fairly
So
large.
you're saying he could, on site, if he's raising beef here for his retail market, if he was raising beef here, he could have a sign here.
I guess he could do a big neon sign, you know?
Oh, come on now,
I'll be
Evan,
here.
I'm not picking on you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so.
Yeah, okay.
But I mean, let's think about this. Why is that part prohibited for any other ones? What's the purpose behind that?
Well, we don't want
What
people
value,
leasing out commercial signage on their property. The main thing, we don't want a sign company, people putting their signs on our protected lands. I understand that, but I was trying to get down to exactly if this man's scenario that he's going to have a beef operation, he wants to retail, and he's going by the Blue Ridge Parkway, and they see how beautiful it is.
Yep.
Can he have a sign that fit that system and work for him?
Well, let's think about that big one up in Caswell County that does on-site retails. I mean, they got a lot of signage, and that's A-okay, and they got USDA funding too. So.
Okay, all right. You
So
have
that
to have
doesn't-
marketing.
Sorry, that doesn't distract from the scenic value, that secondary.
Yeah.
Well, that's a part of the other signs. But again, you know, if we're looking at how can we maintain and improve ag operations, if that's part of what they're doing, then I don't think we should be inhibiting that.
Well, thank you. That answered one of my questions.
Okay. Got some more?
I have a lot of them. I'm all questions, but I don't want to
Okay.
filibuster this meeting.
All right. Evan's got limitations on impervious surface.
All right, so on this one, the standard is going to be a 2% impervious surface threshold maximum. So what that means, if you look here, there's good examples about what impervious surfaces are. On this, a good tool that we have in our BDR checklist is how to calculate these. So this is going to include farmstead area, so anything in the easement. And so in the BDR, you're going to have a table of all the different impervious surfaces and their square footage. And so that's the easiest way to calculate it. So just be mindful of that. And it's good to, when you're doing the site assessment and then with a grant award, you're doing the BDR, you have that number. You can calculate what the remainder is, and that's something that you'll have to take into account on each annual monitoring visit.
And that table and more specifics on that is in your ADFP baseline requirements checklist in your packets also. And we'll go over that a little bit more too. So. I passed around a few smaller maps, so feel free to share if you want to reference. So we are up here by the feedlot, which doesn't show on the aerial, but in this corner right here. So this field is in the easement. Well, would be in the easement if there was an easement on this property. So again, this property did not go through the application stage because there were not enough of the prime or productive soils on the property. So this is one that we looked at and worked with the landowner a bit, but it is not moving forward currently because it didn't meet the criteria for the ALE funding, just ADFP. But we're just looking at it as if there were an easement on it for example purposes. So all of the open area over here, the houses were once part of the farm and those were sold off for retirement income, I believe, as part of the family estate planning. And there's a lot of the hillside over here that's included, and then the hill that we saw over there when we were by the house. So just for context and reference as to where we're at. So the second handout in your on your clipboards is the ADFP BDR requirements checklist. So again, just something for your reference to see what all is required by them in your baseline documentation when you submit that. We talked a little bit about the impervious surface table, and then most of these things are all in this Daniel's Farm BDR that I'm going to walk through with you guys. So if you have any questions as we go through that, there's also more of a table checklist, which is pretty much the same thing as the narrative, it's just in a different format. Okay, I'm going to go. So this is the Daniels Farm BDR that I mentioned yesterday. It's also the property where we had to carve out the area with the fires. So we might be able to see that in the survey. But just to walk you through the different components of the baseline, it starts with an owner acknowledgement of condition, and that outlines all of the parts and pieces in the baseline. And this is the primary document that's signed at closing, stating that both parties, the grantor and the grantee, agree on the condition of the property, that all of the information in the baseline is accurate. You can also initial all of the pages, by ADFP.
Yeah, just signature.
Yeah. And then we go through property information. So we have a nice narrative outlining the conservation values, the property information, the history of the property, the agricultural management, natural communities, if that applies. Timber management, and then your summary of the restrictions and limitations. So it's usually just a couple of pages, so real short and sweet. Clearly you need to look at the details of the easement, but this really helps, bring those things to mind of what to look for when you're monitoring, especially any quantitative rights. If you've got qualitative questions, then you need to go look at your details. The owner contact information, so this is clearly going to change over time, but just having the original owner information, and you can update your records, how to access the property, different folks involved in the management of the property, the forester, any farmers that might lease the property other than the landowner, directions to the property. This is one that ADFP requires with the access to the property. You think they want us to feed them, or they don't like us being here? So showing the public roads going to the property, and then showing the interior roads on the property as well, so that it's very clear how you can navigate the property. If there is not a public roadway, clear access across another property, which also needs to be documented on your survey. We talked about survey requirements yesterday, all the utility rights of ways, access, ingress, egress, easements, exclusion areas, farmstead areas, all of those things need to be on your survey. The whole property versus the conservation easement property, detailed acreage, all of those things. Tax information from the county, so oftentimes the county might not have the exact same boundary as what comes back in your survey, That may be just because of outdated information, or it may be also because you have some exclusion areas. So just showing the difference between those two can be important sometimes. Protected lands network map. So for the application purposes, you need to show the agricultural easements in the area plus other protected lands. So that would probably be good to differentiate as well. And here, this one just has all of the protected lands. Daniel's Farm was part of the Sentinel landscape in eastern North Carolina. So we've got that map to show how it fits into that. It was funded with our CPP through that? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's that? I'm not good at 50/50.
Aerial photographs as close as you can get to the date of the easement. I think this easement was done in 2019. This is a 2016, so it's unfortunate we couldn't find something closer, but as close as you can get. And then if you need to acknowledge some changes on the property, so like we went out to Summit Lakes last week and there was clearly a lot of changes in the forestry where they had thinned a lot of the hardwood. So some of those things you would definitely want to note that has changed. You'll see that in your photos also, maybe put it on your land cover map. Topography and hydrology, so we try to do a couple different scales here so you see how it fits into the watershed context as well as more locally on the property itself.
They just agreeing with you.
It's a peanut gallery over there. Land cover map, this one in particular is the national land cover data and the national wetlands inventory. Soils maps, just straight from Web Soil Survey with the report there and showing your farmland classifications, prime soils, the report there. And then we go through and I don't know if y'all require this or if it's just something we started adding, but pulling the information about each soil type from the county soil surveys just to have more details on the soil properties. Okay, man-made features and impervious structure. So in this case, there were no impervious structures on the property. So if there is not, it needs to be clearly noted for ADFP so that it just doesn't look like it was omitted. But we do show the roads here since those are man-made improvements. Forest management plan, so this one had over 20 acres of forest, so we've got a forest management plan. Forest management plan has all the soils data too, so.
We do require that.
You do, okay.
The description of the soils, yep.
Okay, so.
But I think that's generated with the Web Soil Survey report, right?
I think it can be, yeah. I should probably look into that because I've been pulling them straight from the survey. Okay. Photographic records. So here you've got your landscape photos of the property. They do not have to be pans like this. That's just the way I like to do it for more context on the property. But having general photos of the property, ideally from every corner for ADFP, and to get a clear inventory of all the different land cover types, activities, and uses on the property, any structures, anything that would be mentioned in the base, in the easement itself. I think we'll look at the ADFP checklist again, but I think it says they need to be easily replicable. So, don't try and walk into the very middle of the forest or whatnot, Try and keep them along general access roads. And of course, boundaries, do your best to get to the corners or corners. But, don't try and get them too isolated. And you will have a map that shows where all of those photos were taken. So your GPS points. So here we don't have a whole, I mean, we couldn't get to, you know, all of these corners clearly, but we've got a good spread across the property there. Your index, having your compass directions, that's required also for y'all, right?
Yep.
Compass heading for which direction you took your photo. Environmental site assessment, so that whole report is in here. That's a good 100 pages or so usually. So we won't look through that, but the recorded copy of the conservation easement, which is not in this one, just got a placeholder, and then your credentials of the baseline prepared.
Lisa, would you have the conservation plan in there as well? Because that one just had
Yes,
forest
so
management
this
plan.
one just has the forest management plan, but yes, you would definitely have the conservation plan as well. And we had that question come up too. I'm not sure why this one didn't have the conservation plan. DeWitt and I weren't sure if it was not required or if we just don't have it in this.
He approved that one, so
It was
Yeah.
Easter.
he should know the answer.
So it's,
But he's retired now, so he doesn't have to.
Yeah,
so now we'll work on some more of the easement template.
E. The width's bigger instead of ED.
Any questions on
The width's big
baseline?
We got a lot of those.
Yeah.
Here, I got a thing stuck to my jacket.
Detailed document.
Yes. So that is something that if you do have capacity and your staff should be able to have the qualifications to create something like that, but it's certainly something that you can have done out of house and your can get reimbursed for that in your grant funding.
Yep, that's all I want to mention there, is that this is an allowable cost. So I know that's a big topic with new districts get involved. What's this going to cost? So that can be something that is reimbursable through our grants.
What's the time frame? Has to be done within what period of time?
There's not a specific time frame, but as close as possible to the easement closing.
Well, yeah, there's a deliverable schedule in the contract, so it's going to say in there exactly when it is. Because these contracts, although they're 2 years, we have them scheduled so you can get these done in a year. Now, of course, the big sticking point is other funding sources, because that requires additional approvals, and then any other things that pop up, and that usually happens with title work or issues with surveys, that type of thing. So that portion in the contract has that breakdown on when it's due.
Okay.
What happens if the landowner says no at the 11th hour?
Who's responsible for costs?
Do the district get paid for the cost?
The contract that's signed says if it's not recorded, you got to pay us back. So that on that point, then it's important to have a contract between the entity and the landowner saying, if you don't get this done, you got to pay the entity back. So I think that is a very important point. That's kind of really get into those details on how to actually make things happen. And so there are existing agreements that can be used as examples or templates on that. But that is a very, very good point. That's something that needs to be covered, because in our contract, it's going to say, if you don't get it done, you got to pay the state back. And that's the entity. And another point, the contract is not with landowners; it is with the entities.
So that was the district.
Yep.
If it was the district working with the landowner, the district would be have to come up with those funds back to the state.
Correct.
If there wasn't an agreement with the landowner.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's always going to be that way.
Right, they're
Yep.
responsible, but the
Well,
district should cover their
That's right.
behind
Yep. That's right.
to have that contract with the landowner.
That's correct. Yep.
And then you wouldn't want to incur any expenses before the contract's actually
Yep.
signed,
That's correct. Yep.
other than perhaps appraisal, but you're still trying to avoid that.
Well, at that point, you wouldn't want to do that, because you want to have it in the contract period. So even though it's not an allowable cost, that's a deliverable that needs to be done within that period. And again, in that contract deliverable schedule, it'll have that included in there. as I mentioned yesterday, we had some rule changes in the first quarter meeting, and one of those was allowing the appraisal to be good for a year. And so that is consistent with USDA policy and the 2 military services that we work with currently. So hopefully that makes things easier. The only consideration, and again, this goes back to not providing tax or legal advice, but if they want to have a qualified contribution with the conservation tax deduction, that has to be within 60 days of the contribution. And so in our legal review, we consider the contribution as the easement being recorded and executed. So that's something that you need to, again, point them in the right direction to make sure that they're doing that, because the appraisal that's submitted is going to be it's going to be Working Lands Trust or a district to NCDA. Their appraisal for tax purposes has to be for them on the same project. So it's a little bit different. So again, put them in the right direction to research that. But those are the main principles with appraisals there.
So their appraiser could update it or make any changes as needed to fit that 60-day window.
So let the landowner pay up front for doing all those things. That way you don't have to do it, and then he can be billed through the district or the land trust. He can bill through them to get those funds back later.
That's how they want to do it.
How does Working Lands do it?
So Working Lands pays for the survey, the BDR, all of those things, and then submits to ADFP for the reimbursement.
So we would be out. Working Lands would be out.
Yeah, so I think there's one situation where they did eat the costs of one project, but I don't know that there was an agreement with the landowner.
There was not an agreement in place. So that was a tough lesson, but something that we can certainly share, that it's very important, because that situation has occurred.
So now we have the agreement.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. I think y'all do. Again, that's not. We're not getting into the details of that, because that's not our.
Yeah. So
game,
I will confirm that we do that. Yes.
I'm pretty sure you did.
Yeah,
but
we're looking for serious advice.
My advice is I will consult with my other staff members and get back to you.
So do the roads through this property like they are here, does that cause issues?
No, as long as it's shown on your survey and is clearly, is this excluded?
This is a state road.
Yeah.
Right there.
So on the map, does it show the parcels outside of it? Yeah. Yeah, so there's clearly a separation with the roadway, so it's already excluded from the parcels.
Okay.
If there was a road right-of-way going through the property that hadn't been constructed yet, we would need to exclude that.
Yeah, with existing road right-of-ways, going back to what we said yesterday, since North Carolina is a race jurisdiction, and of course DOT always does pretty much have superior claim on that. So that would be a situation where it would be delineated on the survey. There would be, that would have the reference to that, and pretty much go up to, you could exclude it, or you could go up to the center line or wherever it is. But kind of the same principle with the railroads or utilities, is that there's an assumption of risk there. So if you had something up against the road and it got destroyed because of maintenance or construction or other issues, then that's the risk you're assuming.
So he was looking at Ale in the app originally. He could go back now and look at PUV, since it's an option now, the way this track is structured.
Yes, I think this would be a situation where the value of the property and the PUV would not be favorable.
Correct.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
Probably so.
But we can certainly look at it, and talk with them about it.
So a consideration there would be look at the last time there was an assessment, see what the schedule is for Watauga, and maybe wait till that point if you want, if that's the only feasible option, or the only, because if ALE is not an option and they want to ensure a higher level, then maybe wait until Watauga's reassessment, see what happens.
But
They're looking at them every 4 years. Counties do.
But I think,
But the full
Well-
in detail is 8 years.
and then I think there was delays with COVID too.
Okay.
So I think everything's backed up.
So yesterday you were saying if there's an area of high development and the property is primarily in farmland, then that would usually not be favorable to do the PUV, right?
Yeah, that would be favorable because
would
a
be.
high development area,
Okay.
because the present use
Would be.
value is there's going to be a cap on that,
Okay.
no matter what.
$1,200 per acre.
Right. That's the maximum that a county tax assessor can value it at, and a lot of times it's less.
Okay.
So that gap is increasing. So we've had a few situations where that gap was pretty big.
Yeah, and I'm surprised the gap's not big here.
Yeah.
It might be. We have to look at it, yeah.
It's not.
Oh, it's not. You looked at it.
Scott has looked at it.
Evaluation
Okay.
was very low on this property.
Gotcha.
The appraised value was very low. It was totally unfavorable.
Okay.
I don't remember the numbers, but it was way, way low.
Okay.
But if he wanted to, he could pay for an appraisal and use that,
Yes,
Yeah,
but
okay.
so he could only get the ADFP funding, not
right.
the additional ALE, which, yeah, I think they were looking for more of the easement value. Yeah. Okay, let's jump back into our template. So in Article 3, we are looking at the rights and responsibilities retained by the grantor. So the grantor reserves all customary rights and privileges of ownership, including the right to sell, lease, devise, that is prohibited within the deed, consistent with the purpose. Nothing in this deed shall require the grantor to take action to restore the property after an act of God or other event which they have no control. And this does not relieve them of any obligation of imposed by law. So things that we've already covered. A lot of these have repetitive information, but repetitive is good. Right to farm.
That's me. So the landowner has the right to farm or permit other people to farm and do other agricultural activities as long as it's in consistency with the conservation values and the ALE plan and the federal and state laws and regulations. And it says farming, grazing, horticultural as long as they're not removing any of the topsoil, and then animal husbandry are allowed as long as they're consistent with the best management practices that North Carolina has put forward. So
It's with the conservation plan. So
Yes.
everything's going to tie back to the conservation plan.
So the right to privacy, it just says that the grantor still retains the right to the privacy and that the deed is not intended to create any public rights to the land either.
So that's a pretty common question that we get, because when people think about easements, they might think of a right-of-way easement, access. So that's an important point to emphasize with landowners, is that there's no public access. There's going to be parts later about access by the easement holder and the parties too, but those are for circumstances. And so we've been approached about trails and that kind of thing, and our policy is that we're not going to adjust any easements for that. So you want to have a trail, you have to exclude it, I guess. But I mean, we think about especially the threat we had with high path avian influenza recently, right? Biosecurity is paramount in that situation. So again, that's hopefully in those conversations you have with landowners, that's something that if it comes up, you can be pretty firm and assured on it, and you can use those types of examples to underscore what you're talking about there.
Okay, right to use the protected property for customary rural enterprises.
Eric had that one.
Oh, okay, okay. Let's see. Customary rural enterprises, farm machinery repair, sawmills, firewood distribution, and this is where we get into ecotourism, agritourism, and special events, and the definitions there related to those. Any structures required for those must be within the farmstead building envelope. It's all subject to the impervious surface. All activities must be compatible with the purposes.
Should a contemporary structure be outside of the farmstead?
Any permanent or temporary structure. That would be in very limited extreme cases.
Like a running shed or a shelter for small livestock?
I'm reading that part is inside the farmstead.
Yeah, I could have just mentioned that. Let's see, the part under the structures that was more specific to that. Short answer, no, but we'll look for.
So could he put a shed over the feed trough? Protect the feed
Temporary
trough?
structure?
You call it a permanent structure, but you could call it temporary.
Well, but
I mean, it's just on, 6x6 post or something other with a tin on
it's not in the farmstead. I mean, that's the general guidance. If it's not in the farmstead, it's got to be temporary if it's related to the ag operation.
How do you define temporary?
I don't know. That's
Not permanent.
I mean, he
nobody
Right,
knows.
like a season, right?
rip that up and move on.
Yeah. Well, but that's. I don't think
Defining temporary, the things that we have
we've been talking about that for
remotely
years.
discussed have included concrete
Yep.
and an electrical wire.
Yep.
Well, and I seen one time when we had a cold frame on Reed's farm. That was
Yeah. I mean, that's. But I don't think we had complete consensus with everybody on that. But that would be my general guidance: is concrete and you have to wire it.
Timing wise, I would think less than a year.
Yeah, I mean seasonal.
Okay.
We've researched it. I mean, me and Scott's talked about this for hours, and I've looked it up, and USDA doesn't have anything on it, and I don't think nobody knows what temporary structure is. So it's kind of like you know it when you see it.
A shade,
Right.
I'm thinking, well, we have extreme heat.
Yep.
So they decide to provide shade for the cows here.
Well, that's going to be in the farmstead area, so it would be unallowable in a farmstead area.
Is this being called the farmstead then?
Yeah,
It was
it's
never
gonna have to be.
defined,
It
but
was never
yeah.
defined, but you were gonna put it in a,
It was going to be.
yeah, okay,
Looks like it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
all right,
So with Farmstead,
you're fine.
yeah, you just gotta maintain the below the impervious surface
Right.
threshold.
So, case by case, working the situation out with your landowner, getting the information, what does the other parties involved, what are their views on that. So, but it's going to be different for every situation. So we were working on
Yeah, this
the
is a big
rural
section.
enterprises, ecotourism, agritourism, special events. So there's specific language related to time for special events. You want to hit highlight?
Yeah, so ecotourism, I mean, that's going to be low impact, nature-based activities, so a hike or kayaks, that type of thing. Agritourism, and actually in here it doesn't have the complete, all the different allowable activities with agritourism. And again, this is with NRCS, so this is was negotiated, but I would say in our view we're going to use that guidance. So I did mention hunting earlier, and it's actually not specifically in here, but the statute does allow for that. Hunting, fishing, there's going to be, let's see what else is on here. Yeah, those are pretty broad. So this is probably NRCS driven language in this section, but for our purposes on the state, we're going to use the guidance and the statute on that. Special events, if you look at that portion of the statute as well, the bona fide farm zoning exemption 160D, that's going to include specific references to weddings and events that are taking place because of the rural setting. So that's going to fall under the special events part, because It's in that part, it's not in the agritourism listing, but it's in the, lack of a better word, it's in the rural setting portion of the statute. So it does have some examples in there. A question that comes up, where do people park for these events? They gotta be in the farmstead or not on the protected property. And that's, and another question when we're talking about that, we talked about the 15% acreage maximum for farmsteads, which is going to be a rule. Well, a question came up, why is it 2% impervious and 15% farmstead? Well, that's a good example of how that can be fluid, because you have cars parked that in a 15% area, but that's not, because those are temporary, right? And it's for a special event, that would not be part of that impervious surface. So that's kind of where those two percentages work together.
Just to go back to your question about the shed, I'm sorry if I'm stealing whoever 3.4 was, but
You can steal it.
and I think this is new, but so if you look at the second paragraph, minor ag structures such as feeding, water facilities, livestock run-in, as long as it doesn't exceed certain square footage. Hold on just a second. And that don't have an adverse impact can be constructed outside of the farmstead building envelope with prior written approval. And I think that's new.
So I think our conversation with DeWitt was that the approval is difficult.
Okay.
I think it has to be a pretty justified cause to have it outside of the farmstead area, but what do you
Well, would something like his example be a shed for the cattle in extreme heat?
So if you look at the bottom, this was finalized last summer.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there were some changes with NRCS language. So I mean, our general guidance is stick to the farmstead.
Keep it in the farmstead.
Because
yeah.
Well,
that's what I thought. I mean, that's when I read that. That's the first time I've ever seen that.
State, then you have to get it approved by the feds, and it's just a difficult process. Yeah.
And you know, going into, are we going to this section now?
Sure.
All right. So this
is
is
3.4.
Very long section. And another change, and if you've like Ryan and long-time easement folks, there's been different language for farmstead and homestead and residential envelopes. Well, again, a part of the updates with the NRCS template, all those items were rolled into farmstead. So if you look on page, what's my page number? Oh, 11. Page 11 has these different sections about residential. And you see it has single-family residential. That part in DI is existing. DII is new. And so those may or may not exist, right, or under construction. And then 3 I's there, farm support housing. So all these are going to be in farmstead building envelopes. So that's a little bit of a terminology change. So I'm having to retrain myself and others.
So you're saying residences now are defined under farmstead?
Yep. It's going to be in that section like that.
Oh, okay.
I mentioned that yesterday too, and that threw me because in some of the other workshops we talked about how the residences have to be within the residential envelopes versus the farmstead, but now all farmstead.
So any envelope that will permit construction on it is farmstead.
Yep. So if you look at what's going to happen is you'll have these sections included, and if you look here, it's going to have the reference to Exhibit B. So it will be delineated on the survey. It's going to be referenced there. So there is going to be detailed information about these categories, but broadly, everything that in here is farmstead.
Farmstead. Okay.
So if you look to our statute, 106.744, I think it talks about 3 building envelopes. So we're going to allow for those 3 in these sections I and II and III, right? So those are residential And so you can have up to 3 included with the easement, picking out of those.
But those are still restricted, so those envelopes still can't be sold separately.
Right. These are all included. Yes.
Okay, right, still be a part of it. Right. So still, if a landowner wants a house site that could be sold independently of the easement, he'd still have to just exclude it altogether.
Yep.
Gotcha.
And again, it makes life easier if they're excluded, because then you're not worrying about in here. It's got a square footage requirement or maximum in here. The impervious surfaces. Yep. So you're removing some of the headache for all the parties if it's excluded. But again, one thing that we've seen in other states with older easement programs is that big blocks with a house site included, price is going up.
Right, yeah.
I mean, it becomes more valuable as there's more development in those areas.
Oh yeah, no, I'm just thinking in some of the ones we've done in the past, this would have changed the landowner's decision whether to exclude the place or not. So, yeah.
Also gives the landowner flexibility to have a guest house,
Right.
caretaker, manager house.
Or if it's future planned building, they wanted to put a house there, said, we'll scrap that, I need another barn, they could put it there instead. So it's...
And then it would just be subject to impervious surface. There's no limitation on the number of ag buildings, ag structures.
But still limited to 3 residential structures.
Included, yes.
Okay.
So if you say 3 residential structures or 3 building envelopes, it's still, if it's in the conservation easement, you could potentially have in the future have 3 different houses on that easement that would all have to be under the same ownership, all be after. So you can have them, but that's
And so that goes back to the planning process, right?
Yeah.
So that's not, probably in this scenario, the most feasible option would be either the existing or a future one plus farm support housing. That's probably really the only, in reality, the best option to include.
But if it were mine, I would max out that 15% because you're talking about forever.
Yep.
So you would say, well, I want to designate 3, even though you may never use.
And you have to balance that out though with the appraisal, because you're still retaining some of those development rights there in that farmstead area.
So they adjust.
Yes.
They'll adjust that according to how many of those you put in there.
So you got to think about the money side too.
Okay, I hadn't even thought about that.
So how would that adjust?
To go
How would that
by.
adjust? I mean, you have 15% out of 100 acres. That's 15 acres, and you're putting out 3 envelopes per house that's in that.
Well,
So that's going to make that land appraised for more, or the development lots.
well,
less?
again, it goes back to if
It would be
these
more or less.
if these housing options are included or not. The restriction of just ag-related infrastructure is not going to be as high,
Right.
but you're still retaining development rights. So,
Right. You're trying to sell a piece of property to somebody that wants to live there. It's going to be more marketable if they can build a house on it than if they can't, or if they can build multiple houses on it than if they can't. So the value would conceivably go up in that case.
I couldn't give you an answer on how much it moves the needle. And
Or which way?
Well,
Do you know which way?
The payout is going to be less.
Payout's going to be less
Because you're retaining
more
the development
much
rights.
You go up to 15%, which if you max that out, you're saying,
It's going
since that's more development rights.
Yep, because you're retaining some of those development rights. Yep.
What if you keep 15% and you don't have the houses in there?
Well, that's not going to be as much as residential, but you're still retaining some development rights because you're able to build barn sheds, other infrastructure.
But in the future, I could see where those would become rare and put upward pressure on price. In fact, one of the farms I went to, the only one I've been to for a monitoring visit that had been sold, and it had a new owner. And this guy thought he was halfway to heaven because he had a nice house sitting in the middle of I don't remember, 50 or 60 acres of the beautiful pasture land and forest land, and he had a scenic view, and he knew nobody was going to build in that area. I mean, he lived in Charlotte, but this was his mountain place, and it was beautiful, and he loved the fact that it had a conservation easement on it, and I'm sure he paid well for it. And I believe it.
So that's where the appraiser would have to take into account if there are any easement comparables in the area. So if there's a lot in that region, otherwise looking at
they have a basis for adjusting their appraisal accordingly.
And not that it necessarily helps you right away, but I've always heard your neighbors will love you for it because you increase their property values.
Right. Yeah. The enhancement rule.
Right.
Well, the enhancement rule applies to if it's family.
Family, right.
But yeah, it's still
boosts surrounding. So this deals with recreational improvements and uses. So we were talking about hunting. Here's where it expressly says that the landowner still reserves these particular rights: hunting, fishing, hiking, bird watching, etc., and also the right to restrict other people to those activities on their property, and or allow those activities. And
so on that, see that part there says optional commercial recreational activities are not permitted. If you remember yesterday, I was talking about how there's all these different states have different rules on agritourism. My view, in being consistent with the statute, because the statute says these agritourism activities can be paid or unpaid. So to me, we would not include that part in there.
Optional statement.
Right. I think that would be either, I mean, that's probably, well, it is. It's in RCS language included in there. Presumably a landowner, if they wanted to have that, they could include it. But I don't think it's something that we're going to, that's why it's optional. Right. Because we're not pushing that.
So if you were going for ALE though, is that statement not contradictory to what the state says, or would you just not pursue ALE funding because you want to do?
No, that's optional. This is the final template. So really, this is an option for the entity and the landowner to include or not include. So again, if someone asked me, should I include this or not, I would say don't include it, because agritourism is paid or unpaid.
They may never use it, but you want to leave it the option. So most people want to just leave it on.
Yeah, unless for some reason they're adamant that they don't want it on their land, but you would discourage them from it, Yep, 3.6.
So for 3.6, it's utility services, septic systems, and fuel storage. So basically, if there's like installation, maintenance, repair, replacement, removal, and relocation of electric, gas, and water facilities, sewer lines, and other public or private utilities, that's including telephone or other communication services, either over or under the protected property for the purpose of providing those services. It is permitted as long as you get prior approval from the grantee. There's also above ground storage tanks for fuels or other materials for residential or non-site or on-site agriculture use. They are permitted with a maximum of 1,000 gallons, but those tanks must be located within the farmstead, just to minimize any pollution.
Question on that one for the fuel storage tanks: is it a total of 1,000 gallons over all of the tanks, or is it per tank?
Per tank.
Sounds like per tank.
Above ground storage tanks.
Yeah, I would read it that way.
Permitted up to a maximum of 1,000 gallons. Yeah, that's what DeWitt was saying with us too. Yeah.
It's just 1,000 collected.
Per tank.
Per tank?
So you could have 5,000 gallons as long as it's 1,000 gallons.
Yeah,
because they each have their own containment area.
That's how I'm reading it, as long as it's 1,000 over here in this tank and 1,000 over here in this tank.
Yeah. Or you'd have to exclude it from the farmstead, because you have quite a number of operations of size that will buy tractor trailer load lots of fuel just to get the price for it.
And put it in multiple tanks?
No, they put it in one tank normally.
I don't know what. Oh, okay. Yep, limited to 1,000. Any more on that one? All right.
And one point I do want to make here, if you go down to I think it's after that first long sentence. The granting or modification of easements for such utilities is prohibited when the utility will adversely impact the purpose of the ALE deed. So again, talking about race jurisdiction. So if there is not one existing, this easement was here first, right? So that's that principle. I think you might be able to, this could be a good marketing point if the landowner is concerned about those types of things as well, because that is pretty explicit in that prohibition.
Other thing there on the tanks would be like liquid nitrogen. Typically those tanks are anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000. That seems to be a little prohibitive.
Well, let's
even within the farmstead for ongoing ag operation.
Let's make a note on that. We might need to compare. It might, again, a lot of this could be NRCS driven language. I don't know. So let's make a note and check on that. I don't have an answer for you.
I may just be confused. But so you're talking about you can allow these with prior written approval of the grantee, provided, however, the prior written approval is not required for utilities located entirely within the building envelope.
So if it's in the building envelope, you don't have to get approval.
Okay, that's it.
Protected property, you do have to get approval.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, good there. All right, forest management and timber harvest.
Okay, briefly, forest management and timber harvest is allowed as long as it's using best management practices. So if you've got a forest management plan and following that forest management plan, everything should be good. Basically, the issues that you would be dealing with in relation to the easement would be soil erosion. That would be the big issue that would be relative to timber harvest.
And forest management not required for non-commercial activities. So if you're cutting for roads, utilities, buildings, structures, doesn't have to be in the plan. Cutting for trail clearing, domestic use, firewood. Okay.
So the last on page 13, the last section of there is that forever wild portion. So again, that's something that's come up a few times, and if you have a landowner that is really adamant about that, I mean that's a showstopper, because I mean we're looking at managed timber operations. So if there is that type of landowner desire, that's going to have to be an exclusion, because that's just completely against the previous section that we just looked at.
Because it's no longer working land.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, or direct them to a partner land trust, but can't get the ag funding.
So, this is something that we are trying to encourage. Call it the jigsaw puzzle, where you have different funding options for different portions of properties. So the easy example would be CREP, right? So if and we're not up this way, I guess, but in areas where it is, conceivably, that would be an option for a landowner, where you could have two easements right up against each other. And if you think about the values around streams where CREP would be eligible, there's no development value down there. So really, they would be maximizing their cash considerations if they're able to include those other types of options in areas like that. So related to this point, if you have folks that want to have this type of forever wild section, there could be other funding options available, and they could actually provide more funding to the landowner too. So we're certainly not opposed to having the jigsaw approach, but kind of like the right to privacy, I mean, this is something that we're really not going to budge on.
Is that considered match?
No.
Crap?
Since it's two different projects, two different easements, yeah.
And that doesn't have to be parceled out, can all be within the same parcel, two easements in the same parcel.
Yep.
Okay.
Again, you just have to think about access.
Right, okay.
That's going to be the big thing. So
For each easement separately.
Yep. So a CREP one, obviously, if it's down there at the stream or the river, right, it's going to be probably less accessible. And I think boat landings don't count. You got to get there on foot.
Yeah.
So
Can't fly in.
Just got to think about it. Yeah, can't fly in either.
Okay. Okay, water rights. We'll finish Article 3 and then we'll walk back or walk to another location. Water rights.
All right, water rights. The landowner shall retain and reserve the right to use any water rights sufficient to maintain the agricultural productivity of the protected property. The landowner shall not transfer, encumber, lease, sell, or separate such rights, water rights, from the title of the property.
So something to look for on the front end when you're doing your property research and title work, but cannot be separated after the fact either. Okay, land application.
I had that one. It does allow for the application of commercial and municipal sludge if the landowner or the property owner wishes to do that, but he has to meet all rules, regs, federal, local, and state regs to do that. But it does have a specific prohibition of using of a domestic effluent onto land. I find that a little bit
So that's
Yeah,
if you're
it's a little
pumping your
strange.
own septic, you can't land apply it.
right.
Interesting. Do people do that?
Evidently,
Somebody's done it.
I hope not, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
No, that's too close to, like,
Well,
yeah.
domestic septic is not treated. So it's a
Right.
continuous flow system, so you have no control over the bacterial diseases or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Versus a municipal system.
There was just a funny story. That being said, there was maybe that shouldn't be on the mic, but there was a funny story of a farm sort of commune in Madison where they were using their natural, human manure.
That was on Netflix, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was a few years ago, so maybe that's what that applies to.
resourceful people.
Okay, natural resource restoration and enhancement.
Well, this one just says that they can contract for repairs and improvements and restoration of natural resources. So basically, they're expected to maintain those natural resources on the property, consistent with the purpose and conservation values outlined in the deed.
And written approval. So I think it would be important to go through and look at everything that requires notice and approval. Make sure you have a list of those, and both you and your landowner are aware of those things.
So it sounds like it's useful when you go through this to almost extract the parts that require attention and almost have like a checklist.
Yeah.
Right, condense this into something that's really user friendly.
Yeah, that's something we used to include in our summary. So I think that's a good idea. Notices and approvals and just a list of that so that you know right there as part of the summary. And the landowner does too. Yeah. So I need to look back at that. Okay. Pond creation and wetland restoration.
Okay, pond creation, wetland restoration, we're allowed to do that as long as it applies with the easement and follows NRCS rules and supports the ag operation, irrigation, livestock, and wetlands can be either used to treat agricultural waste and support critical habitat, wildlife size, and so on. Size of the pond and wetland must be supported by the appropriate documents. So you got to get all your permits and do your planning. Make sure that's all done up front and up to snuff.
So when the ADFP field staff go out, they would make recommendations or let the landowner know when we need updates to the conservation plan, correct? I mean, and the holder, the entity needs to be aware of that too, but.
That's another great debate that we have. So, that's why we got these guys in the field with such great expertise, because I think really, unless it's something that's beyond, it has to be addressed, right? I think they can provide those hints and nudges and that type of thing.
Okay.
It's kind of one of those things where we require the conservation plan and the forest management plan. Our philosophical question that we haven't answered yet is how much do we go into looking at those plans, and are they enacting those practices?
Right, yeah.
You know, I don't know.
And as a general rule, when you go there, you're kind of looking for good management.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not specifically, there's not like, well, you've got 2 more years before you need to get this updated. It's nothing like that.
Right.
It's more like if there's an issue, then you might point out this issue is not consistent with good management or with your plan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you...
And I think there's been some really good experiences with these visits, allowing or showing them the opportunities for whether that's cost share programs or other resources to get those things remedied on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So I hate to skip ahead, but that's my next part is the ALE or sticking to the cons plan stuff. And so just while we're on this, I had a question about that because it's my understanding that so districts aren't regulatory. If someone comes in and requests a conservation plan, we don't make them do that. They don't have to stick to that plan. They could just use that plan for guidance and do whatever the heck they want. Otherwise, obviously, we encourage, proper and better stewardship. But unless you enter the contract for the BMP, I don't think either program is regulatory. So in the later section, it says, you got to keep the person on board with the ALE plan, but the plan itself isn't necessarily enforceable unless this is saying that by agreeing to this, you're agreeing to the implementation of the conservation plan and or forestry plan. And then that goes to what you were saying earlier about when we were talking about forestry. You don't have to harvest the timber per se. So it sort of seems at odds, and I guess maybe you're saying this is up in the air for debate.
Yeah, I mean it's certain. I mean, I think me and Scott again, we've talked hours about this issue, and I think that's probably a good point that you make about being under contract for a BMP. I mean, that's really the only thing that we were able to identify outside of, and there's language in here. The grantee must take all reasonable steps to secure compliance with the ALE plan. So,
but unless they've contracted for whatever specific BMP, the conservation plan in of itself is not a contract. That's just the landowner requesting assistance and guidance and consultation.
Yep.
So I guess there's no answer to that.
But this is a contract.
Right, for the easement.
Mm-hmm.
So is
which
plan enforceable?
Unless you're saying that it does.
It does.
I mean, that line there, yes. Now, if you look earlier, it says, shall conduct agricultural operations on protected property in a manner consistent with the ALE plan.
Right. So then we should advise landowners who have a conservation plan and are interested in an easement that they will have to abide by that conservation plan, but not necessarily contract for a BMP?
Well, the conservation plan is also a living document, so if there is an issue, they can work with the field staff to work through that and rewrite that to address it. And so that's kind of the pro and the con of having the forest management plan and the ALE plan. It gives you the flexibility to work with certain situations specific to the property without having everything spelled out black and white that would then become a violation.
Right, and I guess I'm thinking of instances, so we have a lot of elderly folks, most of our easements are owned by elderly folks who want to protect the property, make sure it doesn't get developed, but they're scaling back their farming operation. So they don't necessarily have the resources nor the desire to implement they're not going to act against the plan, but they're also not going to actively pursue contracts for those BMPs per se. And if BMPs are part of the conservation plan, then is seeking out a BMP contract part of making sure they're in compliance with the conservation plan?
You know, this is the biggest ongoing discussion that we have about monitoring. And, you know, I really don't have an exact answer. I mean, we've researched it, and there's nothing that is definitive out there from anything that I've been able to find. So really the guidance is, you know, our guys are out there monitoring and work in cooperation, you know, being helpful in these types of situations if they see something.
Right.
It really has to rise to a level where there is significant degradation of the topsoil. That's really the only scenario in which we've gone a little bit further in this part. So, you know, it's something that we're aware of. We're continuing to work on it. We're actually going to be, we just got approval for a full-time monitoring and stewardship coordinator, and that person, because it's a new position, and that's going to be one of the big things that they're going to be working on is these outstanding monitoring questions. Right. That, I don't know, if there's there's language that's kind of back and forth in here, but I think overall the goal is we want to make sure that these operations are doing either implementing those best management practices or at least not having any type of negative impacts.
Go back to the purposes, yep.
The conservation plan takes on a little bit of a different perspective when you've got federal.
The conservation plan takes on a little bit of a different perspective when you got federal money involved. When federal money is involved, NRCS monitors that project, and the conservation plan is monitored in that project. If the landowner is out of compliance with the NRCS conservation monitoring of that conservation plan, is no longer eligible for federal funds for ag programs. So that can become significant, and was a big issue with the COVID thing going around with the amount of money that was available for farms through that. But historically, for many years, there's been quite a bit of federal money available for farms. And that likely will continue to some extent in the future. So it's very important that the conservation plan be followed in order to be eligible for that. So I don't know how else to respond to it other than in my monitoring reports where NRCS has an out of compliance monitoring report, I'm going to reference that in my state monitoring report. I don't have the skills to monitor a site the same way they do. They were trained in soil conservation. They're the ones that wrote the grazing guidelines for pasture management and that type of thing. So we're going to reference their monitoring report in ours. So I think that will be significant, Ryan. I don't know who's next.
Well, it's me, but.
Okay.
So it almost seems like if, let's say, they were choosing to switch BMPs, but they're both, let's say it's a pasture land conversion or something like that. Well, the maintenance of the topsoil is still there, but if there was a gully going through it, sticking to the conservation plan is probably a good idea because it's degrading that value, the conservation value in the plan. So, maybe there's a little bit of a grace allowed, if it's just switching BMPs, but they're both, I don't know, along the same plane of conservation.
Yeah, I've always interpreted the conservation plan to be somewhat fluid in that it would recognize if conditions changed over a period of time due to usage of the land or to weather conditions. So if you had the gully develop over a period of time, it suggests to you in your stewardship that you should try to address that. Where it would become definitive and penalty or kind of a drop dead would be, I did go into a BMP and I put it in place. Then I've received funding to correct that issue that developed. And then there's where the enforcement arm comes in. I think, because if I don't do it right or it blows back out, I need to redo it again till it stabilizes. That's just an example, but that's the way I've kind of viewed conservation plans. They're more of a fluid document. They have to change over time because priorities and other things kind of change too.
Right, and you think when, let's say in the instance that Ryan is bringing up with elderly landowners, they don't want to continue with the farming operation, so that last BMP may be cropland conversion, and then kind of let that fade out, but you're still maintaining that conservation value in there.
That's another thing that we have seen and have talked about, is that where you do have that, they don't have the resources or the energy to get out there and do that. Becomes is it productive? It's going toward that kind of wild state, and that's not what we're really after, but I guess that's better than it washing totally away.
Right,
Yeah,
and that
even
hits
if
on
it-
that secondary conservation.
Yeah, secondary, and even if it goes toward that wild state, you're still preserving the capacity to clear it back or put it back into cropland or grow trees. So, yeah. Okay, grassland is the last one.
All right, pastures, grass. You can do it. Put some practices on the ground. So
All right.
I think grassland is a Midwest NRCS term, but for us it's pastures. So
Okay.
you can do it.
All right, let's go on another walk. On your clipboards is the ADFP Conservation Easement Monitoring Policy. So a lot of this we've talked about, but it's a good reference for you to have. It does say in here that I guess Sarah is the current monitoring program manager, but you're hiring a new one.
She's got too much to do. So
Yeah.
well, I mean, on our end, we wanted to structure it in a similar manner as larger land trusts, where they have a stewardship coordinator. Last year was a record year for us. The most acres recorded in one calendar year since the trust fund started. And with the majority being permanent easements, it's only going to go up. So
How much was that?
last year, I think it was 6,700 acres, I think.
How many projects? Do you know?
14 maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're almost to 30,000 total acres. So again, it's only the workload's only going up, and so I need somebody. I need somebody to do all the paperwork they get from these guys and all the potential problems we may have, handling those.
How many entities are y'all partnered with, holding easements with? Do you know? Ish.
Let's see.
Just curious, because I know there's a lot of repeat applicants. Clearly,
I
but
think the number's around 25.
Okay.
Because I know it's 17 counties and stormwater districts based on the slide, right? And then probably however many land trusts. Yeah,
okay.
5, 7, 8.
Okay. So this document just outlines a lot of the things that we've already talked about. Required to monitor at least once a year, complete your reports, try and coordinate with the field staff. Can we coordinate with you yearly, or do you prefer that just to be stick to the once per every 3 years? That's just the minimum?
I would say that for our workload, try to, unless there is an issue or potential issue.
Okay, gotcha. On foot or by vehicle. So in this case, we can't have just aerial or drone footage.
Because on our side, the in-between years, we're using the aerial data.
Okay, so
we consider that separate.
Gotcha. So that's for the on the ground every 3 years, yes, okay. If the entity wanted to do aerial monitoring and not be on foot any of those years in between your monitoring, would that be acceptable also?
So that's where we put it here. The use of unmanned aerial or drones can supplement but not replace.
Okay, yep.
So that's emerging. I think I don't know if any district's doing that, but I know there's one land trust that has a drone I know of that we work with. So that
We do. We're going to be implementing it, but we'll be on the ground.
Too,
Yeah.
then. All right. Well, so again, I think that is something that is
Yeah.
will continue
Evolving.
to emerge and progress. So we'll adapt as we need to, because this was, you can see this is a 2020 revision.
Yeah.
So we updated a few things. That was one thing that we did update.
Just because you're not required to certainly doesn't mean that you shouldn't be going out there meeting with your landowner every year or as often as possible to keep that relationship up. But just making sure that if we're stretched, where those hard lines are.
Where's the reference you just made to the?
It's on this top page 2.
Oh, in the monitoring.
Yeah.
I'm back on your different document. I'm sorry.
Brian, you said that you were doing, you're certified now as a drone.
Yeah, if we ever get a drone, we will certainly supplement our monitoring. I mean, so typically, we arrange a meeting with the landowner, and then I meet with them, we chat, we'll go over the property. Sometimes we go over the whole property. Sometimes we only go over part of the property, but you can interpret from the aerials and from the interview what has changed, if anything has changed, and then like you were saying yesterday, you can make notes, but typically just go back to the office and then fill out our in-house one, and then of course ADFP's one, and then we coordinate. We try to coordinate as best as possible, even though sometimes it makes for a full day. Jeff's got to put up with me for a day there. So yeah, we might do 12 or so in a day or something like that, and they're all over Haywood. But yeah, if we get a drone, we intend to supplement the monitoring that way. And I know Ariel in Buncombe had mentioned that they contract with somebody to do drone flights for some of their monitoring. Or at least I seem to remember her saying that.
I think so.
Yeah.
And Kayla with Wilkes, I think, is also
She's
a drone
yep,
pilot.
she's a drone pilot,
So, yeah. So growing. There's also a section on incident report protocol. So getting more specific, if an issue arises, how ADFP wants that to be handled with their incident report, reviewing that, investigating it, coming up with a corrective action plan if necessary. So just good summary there. Go ahead.
It says within 30 days for that plan of corrective action. That doesn't mean it has to be remedied in 30 days, because obviously with conditions on the ground, it can take longer. It could take over a year, but as long as that plan is written, it's in place, and the entity is doing their part to follow up and track the progress, that's all part of that.
Looking at responsibilities and enforcement. So there's some language in the easement template related to that, but ultimately the enforcement falls to the entity holding the easement. The ADFP, the state, and the feds can step in and require you to enforce, but it's all going to fall back to you. If there's a situation where they have to come in and take care of it, they send you the bill. So it's your ultimate responsibility to work with the landowner to remedy that, although they will be working with you clearly throughout the process as well.
Yeah, and because we have 3 that were with FRPP at the time, which is the NRCS program, and they have their own form for annual monitoring, as I'm sure if you've got some with them. And I think you might know a little bit. So you can do just record keeping, phone interview stuff, but I think they prefer you meet with the landowner, actually go out there. At least once every 3 years, I think
I'm not sure, yeah.
So yeah, they go, if you get one with both ADFP and NRCS, then you're going to be doing at least 2 for those 2, and potentially 3 to keep one for your own records.
Yeah, so when you're building your template, if you don't already have one, or revising your template, try and consolidate those things that those reports are going to cover in the one report. You'll still have to fill out their online form, but you'll at least have the information handy. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that other than going through the language? Okay. Okay, so getting more specific into our responsibilities of the grantor and grantee. Let me see if there's anything here that we haven't covered. Let's just jump into 4.1, taxes.
Okay, so 4.1 is about taxes, and it states that the landowner is solely responsible for any and all taxes and any assessments that are related to the protected property. And if the easement holding entity ever has to pay any of those taxes and assessments, then the landowner's agreeing that on demand they'll reimburse that entity. Straightforward.
Yeah, I don't know in any cases where that would happen, but I guess it could. 4.2, upkeep and maintenance.
So in this section, it just states that the grantor has complete responsibility for the upkeep and maintenance of the protected property, and that the grantee and NCDA have no obligation for that upkeep or maintenance.
Yep. All of these are pretty straightforward. Transfer of protected property.
I don't have that one.
Oh,
but
sorry.
I can read it.
Oh, Eric, okay. Let's see. If the property is transferred, they need to notify you within 30 days. So again, this is something to make sure that you have on your notice list to cover with your landowner. Failure to do so does not impact the easement, but they need to keep you notified if there's any transfer. And of course, we know it runs with the land, carries on with the landowners. So, transfer of the ALE deed.
So it says here that the grantee has the right to transfer the rights created by the deed to any public agency or private nonprofit organization that is qualified under the Internal Revenue Code as well as the general statutes of North Carolina, provided that that organization agrees to assume the same responsibility that was imposed. And if the grantee ever ceases to exist, or no longer qualifies, then those rights need to be transferred to a qualified organization.
Okay. Any questions on that one? It's pretty clear. Yep. ALE plan.
So yeah, this is where I skipped ahead earlier. This is just saying that there obviously has to be an ALE plan for the property, and ultimately it is the grantee's responsibility to make sure that the grantor sticks to that plan, takes reasonable action to make sure that. Spells out that a copy of the conservation plan has to be on file with the grantee, and sort of spells out what a conservation plan is. And then it says shall reflect the BMPs, which are best management practices, and then it sort of just lists for specifics there. So if it's got HEL soils, then it has to comply with the parts of NRCS's standards that apply to that. And the ALE plan will summarize current cropping systems on the protected property as defined by the statute. If applicable, the plan will also include pasture conservation plan to address management of grassland. And then D is, if applicable, a forest management plan will also be in place and to stick to that forest management plan as best as possible. And then, so yeah, the grantee must take all reasonable steps to secure compliance with the ALE plan. In the event of non-compliance, then you have 180 days to take a corrective action. And if that fails, then the United States may come after you.
Y'all don't have any additional guidance on forest management plan? Sorry. Okay. So if you are working with a forester, a landowner with a forester with a forest management plan, just, at least making sure that they have a copy of the deed and point out what's relevant for them to include in their plan as well.
I think the only reference is going back to timber.
Okay. And we always had a practice in my past of making sure that the easement is clearly referenced in the forest management plan as well and tied back to specific clauses, restrictions, etc. if it's spelled out in the plan, which this one, these templates, they don't have necessarily, but still having that tie between the two documents. Okay, inspection and access.
All right, so basically it's with reasonable advance notice to the landowner or with the landowner's prior verbal consent. The grantee or NCDA, NCS, its employees and agents and its successors and assigns shall have the right to enter the protected property for the purpose of inspecting the protected property to determine whether the landowner, its successors, or assigns are complying with the terms, conditions, and restrictions of the ALE deed.
Yep, so just providing notice to get access to the property. Yep. 4.7 enforcement.
Once your monitoring detects or you find a violation or something of concern that needs to be reported, the grantee is the primary responsible person for or agency for enforcement. And the ones I've had to work with, we've identified some situations on some farms, building out of place, some erosion issues, vehicles out of place, abandoned vehicles out of place, and we file a incident report that goes to the grantee, then they are to go to the landowner with it. Takes a little bit of time for all that to happen. Takes a while to get it done. But ultimately it's the grantee that's the enforcement responsible party. Every situation is going to be different, so I think Evan covered some of that earlier about that 90-day, 180-day response times to come up with a plan to correct an action.
Yep.
And then they need to be followed through. Most of those involve, that I've been around, have involved some soil and water issues and some recommendations for the soil and water staff or NRCS staff to be involved in making some recommendations, looking at some federal funding sources that can be used through the soil and water district to correct those erosion issues that I've been involved with. But I mean, you can have anything to happen, from a building out of place to a paved driveway to too much impervious surface, so you just got to be careful watching. We as NCDA go once every 3 years. The grantee goes every year. So our hope is we never find anything because it's taken care of before we get there.
Right.
What we have encountered is some of the grantees, primarily land trusts, they are people that are doing some of the monitoring reports do not have the skills to recognize some of the issues that we deal with. I think that's been one of the things that we've had to work with, is they just didn't know that it was a problem. They didn't recognize it as a problem because they didn't know what it was.
So that'd be in terms of erosion issues?
Particularly with erosion on the ones I've been involved in. Any other comments you might have, Evan, from some, I hate to call names of where they were or describe them because we're dealing with them.
Yeah, no, that's all great points. So one of the changes over time, and like I said yesterday, that before our policy in place and then after, so making this a requirement, our hope is to achieve that objective of what Scott's saying, that by doing that annual monitoring, making sure it's a requirement rather than a best practice, hopefully we can head things off before they become too serious.
And if anything is in question, to always bring it forward and
Right.
make
Most
sure.
of the things that I have been identified have been relatively early on with erosion and gullies. And the way I fill out my incident report is I indicate that this is a concern I indicate that it is very early on and can be addressed very easily now versus what it might be in the future and being more expensive to repair. And I reference who I think the resource people are for the grantee to work with. Primarily Soil and Water, or NRCS is the ones I've done. But I try to reference those things and try to keep them from getting worse. Had one with some erosion down a roadway that was going down a slope, just a two-line road, you know what they are, with gravel in it. Had some gullies starting in it, so I addressed it, when I saw these gullies starting. Well, the grantee went to them and told them about them. They went and found some concrete blocks and threw in them. That made it worse. So on my next monitoring report, I went back and addressed it. The condition has continued to deteriorate. We need to look at some soil and water recommendations for how to handle this water flow in this situation.
And it's still open?
It's still ongoing.
Still an open issue? Yeah.
Things don't go away overnight.
I mean, a potential issue, the reason why it hasn't been addressed, maybe there was no cost share available. Is there a funding limitation because it's all been allocated?
Well, the grantee route, that the tree roots were holding the soil in place, which the tree roots apparently weren't doing that. So, like I mentioned, some people don't have the skills to address the issue. It's not their fault, they just don't have the skills, they don't recognize it. So the people that do have those skills to recognize these issues need to address them and point them in the right direction. And it's a lot easier to correct something early on than it is after the gully is big enough to swallow a pickup truck.
Good points. Rights of the state of North Carolina.
All right, so if the grantee fails to enforce any of those terms in the deed, it's at the commissioner, it goes to the commissioner of ag to enforce those terms. And then if the grantee attempts to terminate, transfer, or divest itself from the rights, title, or interest of the deed without the consent of the commissioner of ag, they will just go back to the state of North Carolina as enforcement abilities.
And then that leads us into the United States right of enforcement. So it's just walking us through the chain. And there's also a diagram in the, I think in the monitoring handout that shows how it goes from the grantee to ADFP to the agricultural commissioner and then up the line. So now we're looking at U.S. states right of enforcement because we've got the federal funding involved.
Probably don't want to get this far.
Nope.
This is a pretty big section, and basically it reinforces all of the language of the original deed and restrictions there, and says that they have their they can exercise the right of enforcement under any authority available, and they can also seek administrative and legal cost or reimbursement for any enforcement or remedial action.
Yep, sounds good. Take care of the issue early on. Work with your partners. Grantor's title warranty.
Okay, this, excuse me. This just says that the landowner owns the land, that if the grantor or the landowner represents that he is the sole owner, that he has the right to convey it, to convey the deed, and that there's no encumbrances or mortgages or anything like that that are not already subordinated or that are not subordinated to the deed, and that he has all the rights to. It says to defend the title to the same against the claims of all persons, and shall have enjoy the benefits derived from the deed.
Thank
The main
you.
emphasis there is on that he owns the property clear and free, and that it doesn't have limitations other than the ones that are applied by the
deed.
easement.
Right. Yeah, so this whole section is, it's not that long, but representations of the parties. Primarily looks like grantor. But so grantor's environmental warranty.
Well, basically saying that the grantor is going to stay in compliance with environmental laws, in compliance with all applicable environmental laws. And if he gets out of compliance with something, he's going to take care of it immediately and follow all practices to make sure he doesn't have any problems with hazardous materials, stuff like that. So it's basically straightforward common sense. If you got a problem and you can see it, of course there's always a person, like Scott says, that doesn't realize they have a problem, but they need to be aware of it. When they do find they have a problem, you need to be encouraged immediately to take care of it. And most people would. They don't want to be out of compliance, most people I've seen. So that's pretty much the gist of it.
Yeah, and then it's got some hold harmless and indemnify language, defines environmental laws and hazardous materials, but yep, that's the gist. This also ties back to your environmental site assessment and the grantor just warranting that they have disclosed all knowledge that they have.
I go back to that. There's a lot of times if you're talking to hardworking farmers, they might be so engaged in their operation they not realize that they have a little problem there. I've seen spilt diesel fuel a little bit, not much. And I say, listen, we need to try to not have that. It may be just filling up a tractor. But that comes with being really having a good relationship with a person. So when you do tell them something, they're not offended.
Right.
And then you can say, pat them on the back and say, help them. And I've seen that with Reed's farm up there and stuff like that too. Here you go. I like using the encouragement before we have to get into that hard side of it. Because most 90% of the people I ever found, if you learn how to talk to them, they will be encouraged right into the right way.
Right, yeah. You're coming at it as a partner. So,
yeah.
And the previous one, the title warranty, also relates back to your title work. So they're just warranting again that everything has come through in the title work. There's no additional knowledge there.
Yep, so just going back to what we talked about yesterday with no quit claim deed, you can't be free and clear with that, right? So that's relates back. And then with the subordination agreements, we asked that in the application, and it's not, if they say there is one, that doesn't mean it's not going to go through, but it's good to have those conversations with lenders to say, hey, here's what we're planning. What's the, will this be subordinated? Does it require a payoff? Like, what's the deal? So it's good to have those conversations up front because we definitely don't want to get in a situation where there's a title issue after you've done a lot of this work and incurred expenses.
In the cases where I've seen the subordinations, as long as the reduction in value of the property is not more than what the mortgage is on the property, they're usually okay with that. Sometimes, if not, I've seen landowners, if they have multiple properties, move the financing over to another piece of land, that sort of thing. Okay, general disclaimer 5.3, grantor warranty liability and indemnification.
All right, this is easy. The landowner or the entity breaks the law, incurs fees, gets sued, it's not our problem.
That, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't assign anybody Article 6, so we'll just run through that. I will run through that if anyone has any questions or wants to add anything on these in particular. But this is just the miscellaneous added here at the end. So recording, we know it needs to be recorded. Talked about that yesterday. Survival of terms, merger of fee and easement. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, where if, I think I said, Jeff had a property with a conservation easement with Working Lands Trust, and he decided he wanted to give us the property, we would therefore need to transfer the easement or transfer ownership of the property. But the easement will survive any merger situation like that. We do not want amendments, but in the case of an amendment, let's see, it cannot affect the perpetual duration. It cannot permit anything that was taken away. It has to be consistent with the purposes. It cannot reduce the protection of conservation values. In fact, it really needs to justify increasing the conservation values. I think there was one case of moving a building envelope, but that was done so in that it increased the conservation values.
Yep, in that scenario, there was a, there's actually a reference in the statute to it. It's called conservation benefit analysis. And so we determined that there was actually more prime soils by moving that farmstead. So that was how we justified the conservation values there.
And that was in the case where the survey was misread, the building was constructed outside of the building area, and that was the creative win-win-win solution. But we do not want to do those if we don't have to.
Third year on resolving that.
I cannot comment on ongoing investigations.
In that, the original landowner placed an easement on the property and took a tax credit. The property was sold to another individual. This individual made the mistake, and since there were some tax implications, everything had to be researched to document that there was no gain in the value of the property to the landowner.
Well, I mean, I think the most important part of that was the current landowner asked to do it, and the entity said, yeah, so he went on and did it, and the entity was wrong.
Yeah.
So knowing these documents.
You need to know the document. You need to know what's in it. And as we have seen, it's different in each template. So you need to know if your funding sources are different, if you're working with a different template, what are the specifications in each of those. Let's see.
It was an older one for us. I just want to point out 5 there, V. Affect the qualification of this ALE as a qualified conservation contribution or interest in land. So this is one that we really look at, and it's something that you can use whenever or if these types of situations come up, because this relates to the IRS, and nobody wants to get crossed with the IRS, right? So if you notice the language, it says affect qualification. So even if someone does not take the conservation tax deduction, if there is an amendment that would adversely affect the qualification of it, it would not be allowed. It has no bearing on whether or not they took the deduction, only if it qualifies. So again, if we look at the protected property, there are, the way it's laid out is what would be the qualifying event. So if there were cash considerations and they wanted to add residential areas, that would change what those values would have been. There's a concept floating around out there about floating farmsteads, and that goes against IRS regs. So that type of proposal would obviously go against this as well. So the contribution is a moment in time. The first page, if you recall, has those percentages laid out. So if there's something that would change how those percentages would have been, right? If you're adding a residential, that type of thing, that would have changed those contributions. And so since we are tightening up the language here with IRS considerations, that would automatically be a non-starter, because you're affecting that deduction or the potential deduction if they didn't take it. So keep that in your back pocket.
And that's where you get into the legal language of the impermissible benefit and private enormement and all those things too. With IRS. Okay. Extinguishment, termination, and condemnation. So we talked about condemnation. If there is a portion of the property that makes it through the state and or the feds and gets condemned, this is more likely to happen on a donated easement or one that doesn't have state or federal funding, probably because we are providing that extra level of deterrent with state and federal involvement. But if a portion of the property is condemned, the funding goes back proportionately to the funding entities. So those proportions are spelled out in the beginning of the easement and come from, well, it comes from your conservation easement valuation and your appraisal, but then your funding is all related to that as well. If the conservation values are such that there are no longer any values existing on the property, I don't know of any instance where this has or would occur, but it speaks to that with extinguishment of the entire easement. If for some reason the ag values no longer existed for whatever reason, it would fall back to those secondary purposes, and it is very hard to terminate or extinguish an easement. So very unlikely scenario, but they've got very specific language related to that. And the last few, we've got interpretation. Everything is interpreted under the laws of the state and the U.S. government. Any ambiguities fall back to giving maximum effect to the conservation purposes. So when in doubt, conservation purposes. Perpetual duration and severability, we've talked about it being perpetual. If any part of the deed is invalidated, it in no way affects the validity of any other provisions. So there's no severability, or it is severable there. One issue with the document does not invalidate the entire document. Subsequent liens, so we can go into this with a mortgage on the property as long as it's subordinated, and there's nothing, by putting the easement in place, nothing that permits you or prohibits you, from getting a mortgage or another lien on the property in the future. Same with, different subsequent easements and restrictions on the property. Nothing can be put in place that would diminish or impair the agricultural viability or productivity of the property, because those are our purposes and our values. And any easements or restrictions shall be subordinated to this conservation easement. This will supersede anything in the future. Notices, so when notice is required, there's specific language there about who it goes to, written letters by mail to all of the parties. Approval, more specific on the approval with notices given in 30 days. The grantee needs, if the grantee doesn't reply within 30 days, they can put in another request for approval. They can also disapprove with specific reasons, of course. Entire agreement. This agreement supersedes all prior discussions, negotiations, and understandings. So everything falls back to this document, not a conversation that you had with the landowner during the application period, not anything else that's written in your files. All of that could be discoverable if you come into a legal situation and could be used for or against you, but primarily everything falls back to this document and any due diligence that supported the closing of this document. Availability of tax benefits, we've talked about that. We do not provide tax advice. You as the holder does not provide tax advice. None of the funders provide tax advice. The landowner is responsible for getting that advice from a qualified professional. Warranties and representations of the grantor, we've basically hit on those as well. They are giving up these rights permanently, but they still have the full use and enjoyment of the protected property otherwise. They are restating that they have no mineral or timber rights severed from the property. And continuing liability. Liability for acts or omissions occurring prior to transfer shall survive transfer. Liability for acts or omissions. What does that one mean?
Sorry, I closed my sheet.
Liability for acts or omissions occurring prior to transfer shall survive transfer. If any liability in place before the easement is still in place after the easement. Sorry, getting tired. And that is the whole document. So then we've got all of our signatures. We've got all of our exhibits. So you'll have the legal description, you'll have the plat showing all of your boundaries, your farmstead areas. If any of the language calls for these other exhibits, I don't know in every case that they're required, but you've got some of your overview maps, current conditions maps, and impervious surfaces. Are those always included?
Generally, those are references to the baseline.
Right, okay. All right, so any other questions, Josh? Yeah.
No, I
I just know you said you had a bunch earlier, so did we hit all of yours?
I had questions, and Evan kind of directed me on agritourism and our personal relationship here on the overflow of parking I've seen. So that has to be addressed. I see a lot of things that can be addressed. It's been very useful going through this easement process. I could have read it 50 times and not got 1/10 of what you all have described.
Right, yeah, I think.
You've got, I won't use that word again, you've got specific.
Granular.
Shut up. And quit picking on me. I don't like that. And, but it's really been helpful. And having you here, Ryan,
Yeah.
is a wonderful thing. You got some good leadership here, and I love seeing Miss Chancey here, Macon County, and I'm hoping some of these other soil and water districts keep going here. I don't know why I ended up giving that kind of a speech, but I think it was appropriate.
Well, thank you, yeah. Yeah, it's not necessarily fun to sit here and go through the whole easement document, but I feel like it's
good. In fact,
extremely beneficial.
I'm going to go back home and I'm going to do my son. Read it, boy. You know what I'm saying? And I want you to read it 5 times. Then I'm going to give him a crash course because they know more than I do. You know.
I don't know. I don't know about that.
Huh?
They know more than you?
Yeah. They think
I don't know.
Think they do. There's the key.
Yeah.
Well, that is all the information that I had to share. We can walk back towards the car, grab any more snacks and drinks if y'all would like, but that's all I wanted to cover. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
And for your participation.